Welcome to Nonprofit Expert, presented by Donor Perfect.
Hello, welcome to Nonprofit Expert, presented by Donor Perfect. My name is Julia, and I'm so excited to welcome our guest, Joan Garry. Joan, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
We're so excited to hear from you today. I know that through your blog and podcast and book and the Nonprofit Leadership Lab, you have become the go-to voice for nonprofit leaders who are hungry to be the best they can. But you came from corporate America to the nonprofit world, and you had zero fundraising experience, and yet today you are a completely trusted voice to these leaders who are looking to grow in this area and who often struggle to engage in fundraising. Could you share a little bit about yourself and how you got into this space of nonprofits?
Sure, I would be happy to. So if someone had asked me 25 years ago if I would be where I am today, I would probably have laughed. I remember my wife, when I was at Showtime, saying, maybe you should go into nonprofit. You'd be a very good fundraiser. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. My wife is almost always right, which is both really helpful and infuriating all at the same time. But I didn't really anticipate joining the nonprofit sector. I was very happy in corporate America, doing well, MTV and Showtime. But as a member of the LGBT community with 3 kids, I actually found myself less than content in a job that did not have meaning and purpose. And knowing that I really wanted to be an advocate for my kids and to make sure that the world treated them well, I decided to apply to join GLAAD as its CEO. And GLAAD is one of the largest LGBT organizations in the country. And I thought to myself, it's kind of, how hard could this be, right? and I arrived to an organization that was in financial disarray, and that's a kind phrase to use, with absolutely no fundraising experience whatsoever. As I like to say, leave it to a board of directors to hire someone with no fundraising experience to dig an organization out of a financial ditch. But the truth of the matter is, Julia, that they understood that it's competencies that drive great development executives and chief philanthropic officers, right? It's competencies. It's not what was the last gift you closed lately.
That's a great point. And I think that a lot of fundraisers feel similar to you, Joan. We talk about this a lot, that people kind of accidentally fall into fundraising. They just happen to be great people, or they're very passionate or whatever, but they don't come in with a ton of fundraising experience. So I'm sure that many of our listeners can identify with how you felt coming into the nonprofit world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There are 2 things that my then development director said to me that have long stuck with me. First of all, that most people who run nonprofits are people pleasers, right? That's just how they roll. And when Julie, my development director at the time, said to me, it does make people feel really good to give to causes that they care about, I was like, oh, okay, that actually ignites my pleaser people gene, right? And then she also said something else that's really, I think, always really, really important. And I don't think that board members really understand this, is that your only job is to invite them to come close, right? They get to decide, right? That once you have made an ask, your work is done, right? That the victory is, in fact, the ask. And so it was really interesting to arrive and begin to understand what fundraising was really about. And since I ran GLAAD, I had then board experience and chaired a board development committee. And so having then played every position on the nonprofit field, I felt like I had some important things to say as both someone who had been a staff member and a board member. And so I thought I was going to launch a website. Someone persuaded me to start blogging, and it kind of snowballed from there.
Well, that's great. And I know when I was in the nonprofit world, and still, I have learned a lot from your blog and from the webinars that you've done. So you're such a valid voice in the space, and we're really excited to learn from you today. And you have such varied experience throughout the sector. Like you said, you've been on staff, you've been on boards, you've done a million things in the sector. So covering all of your wisdom in one podcast episode is probably impossible. But let's just focus on one area that you're really, really passionate about, which is dealing with boards. So let's start at a 30,000 feet level. In general, what would you say is the importance of keeping your board in the know and involved in fundraising?
I think the short answer is that you, as an executive director, simply can't do it all. Right? Is that you have to build this posse of ambassadors, both on your staff side, if you have a development team, and your board, so that you have a troop of ambassadors that are out there telling stories, right? That are out there and working their hardest to invite people to come closer, whatever that means, as a volunteer, an intern, a donor, a journalist, whatever it might be, right? So I think that the short answer is getting your board to understand what development work is about and involved in development work. First of all, it's one of their jobs, but more importantly, it is, I've had people who have said, I just don't rely on my board to be involved in fundraising. We handle it all on the staff side. Or I hear people say, well, we finally hired our first development person, and now the board doesn't have to worry about it anymore. Like, it's a team sport, my friends. It's a team sport. And I believe that engaging your board, enriching them about the organization, in fact, the board can help fuel you rather than actually burn you out.
Yeah. And like you said, there are so many executive directors, development directors, nonprofit employees in general who feel like they have to do it alone. And the board is a great resource. But some people haven't necessarily even set up the board in the first place to be a great resource. You and I know in order to obtain certain status as a nonprofit, a board must be set up. So some organizations may have just called together some of their buddies so that they can check off this board box.
No, really, Julia? I've never heard that before.
Yes. Maybe you and I are, sharing some lived experience here. So what about those people, the people that set up their board with their friends, and their friends didn't really know what they were supposed to do, and the board has since evolved, but the specifics of what the board is required to do aren't very clear. How would you suggest that nonprofit professionals can take steps towards setting up the fundraising conversation with their board?
And you're talking here in a situation where someone's just getting their organizations off the ground, right?
Yeah, I think maybe in the first couple of years, or if they didn't have this conversation in the first couple of years and now they're a few more years down the road, but they still need to have a conversation with the board about the importance of their involvement in the mission.
Well, why don't we take the first question first?
Sure.
And I would say, if I could do one thing and wave a magic wand, I would freeze every individual who is about to put pen to paper on a 501c3 application. I would make them freeze. And then I would shake them by the shoulders. And I would say, no, this is not just a form to fill out. And these are not just boxes to check. You have to stop and you have to think about the skills, the competencies, and the expertise you're going to need to take this wonderful, amazing, remarkable idea you have and bring it to fruition, right? Um, because your box checking friends, they haven't been told they have important jobs. Your box checking friends, they're all about you. They're following you and your passion. But are they really passionate about the mission? And the box checking friends were not curated with the kinds of skills and competencies that are going to be necessary to partner with you to be those ambassadors, right? And what ends up happening in these founder organizations, and this stays, right? It perpetuates, is that the founders end up doing it all. They end up having what I call a make way for ducklings board that are just like, I'm the mama duck and I'm the founder and all these little ducks are following me. And they're saying like, let me know if you need anything. Like that's not the dynamic that's going to drive a healthy and thriving nonprofit.
Yeah, that kind of sounds scary to have a bunch of ducks saying, "Hey, let me know when you need anything."
I believe there are a lot of boards out there that think that's how they operate. They think we have a great executive director, and whenever they need us, we're there.
Yeah, but going back to what you said earlier about the people pleasers, it's difficult to ask people to do things because you just want them to be pleased all the time. So asking your board because they're there is maybe not the best method for a people pleaser, right?
Right. Yeah. And you asked a question earlier, Julia, about several years into the maturity level of an organization, you've got you're going to have a lot of these originals, right? This is the time when it is crucial that you start to recruit at least one or two sort of change makers who you can put on your board governance committee, who can begin to then assess build what I would call the ideal composition matrix for your board. Take a look at what you have, where the gaps are, prioritize those gaps, put a diversity lens on it, and then go and start to curate the board you actually need. So you can totally do it if you're starting with a group of originals, but it demands that at least one of those originals really gets that the board needs to be different, and that you've recruited at least one or two other people who are kind of have an appetite for making that change happen.
Yeah, that's a great point. Looking for change makers in your community is so valuable anyway. In fundraising in general, you should know who your change makers are. So bringing one of those onto your board.
It's something that I talk about a lot. I do coaching for CEOs of larger nonprofits, and I do a lot of work with CEOs who are a couple of years from retiring or a couple of years from moving on to their next gig. And when I talk to the organizations about how ready they are or are not, what are the things how is your board going to be ready? One of the things I talk about is having a board member who has some kind of experience or expertise in the arena of change management is super helpful. Transitions are bumpy, right? And so change management is actually a very, very important skill to curate for on a board.
Yeah, that's a valuable tip. Thank you. And we're talking a little bit about the board knowing expectations for what they're bringing to the nonprofits, but we know boards have some other challenges. For example, for me, prior to working at Donor Perfect, I served at a nonprofit as a development director, and sometimes I felt a little bit disconnected from my board. My executive director mostly worked with my board, but as the development director, I felt kind of distanced. What are some other challenges that nonprofit professionals may face when trying to engage their board? And what advice would you give someone like me who feels a little disconnected or feels like I don't have major access to my board?
So when you say engage your board in fundraising, what do you mean by that? And what did disconnected feel like? Was it about access?
I think it was a little bit of both. So like our board meetings were held by the the executive director, not the development director. And so being in the room wasn't really an option. So presenting fundraising opportunities wasn't really an option. Or when there were times where I had an idea for what my board would do, I'd have to communicate it with my executive director, who would then communicate it with the board. So it's just a couple of spaces between me and the board. And I was the fundraising mindset. My executive director was the relational mindset. So it felt
Yes.
hard for me to encourage my board to do fundraising when my executive director was trying to maintain relationships with them without the fundraising piece.
Well, right. And so you became more of the transactional. Did you do the thing? Did you
Yeah.
sell the tickets? Did you do the right? And then, right, did you become a bit of a sort of a bad cop of nagging the board to get things done?
Well, yes, and only through my executive director, because I wasn't speaking to them directly. So
Yeah.
he would have to explain to them, Julia needs this from you. Did you do it yet?
Yeah. So first of all, let's be really clear: in any setting, private or public, nagging your bosses to get things done is not a winning strategy.
This is a real, very important thing to note, Joan. Good call.
Um, um, so what's missing from the description you just gave me is a partnership between you as the development director and the chair of the development committee.
Mhm.
Right? Is that I actually believe that a thriving nonprofit has a partnership mindset, right? So the CFO is a partner with the treasurer.
Mm.
The ED is a partner with the board chair. The development director is a partner with the chair of the development committee, right? They're not providing, they're not just simply providing oversight, to make sure. It's not just about, is Julia hitting her numbers,
Mhm.
right? It's a partnership where there is a clear charge on that committee that the two of you build together to say, what are the tools, what has to be true in order for this board to be champions, ambassadors, and ultimately fundraisers for this organization? What do you need from me? Right? What is it what would have to be true in order for you to be better at that? Right? And so it seemed to me that, so for example, when I would hire a development director, like, you don't have to get it approved by the chair of the development committee, but that's an important partnership, right? And
Mhm.
so I don't know what the status was of your development committee, but I think that most development committees are not well functioning. Their charges are not clear. I mean, I've actually seen situations where organizations did not have development committees. And when you
Yeah.
said, so why don't you have one? Well, because I want everyone to think of themselves as part of the development committee.
Mhm.
And what that does is it perpetuates some narrative that the people on the development committee are the people charged with fundraising, right? Which is wrong. It's just flat out wrong. To me, a board development committee is a peer accountability entity to make sure that the board has what it needs to be successful ambassadors, champions, storytellers, and ultimately fundraisers,
Wow.
right? And so I think that's really, so an example. If each member of your board should be completely and utterly comfortable talking for 2 or 3 minutes about your organization, why it matters, and a brief impact story with a close that says, would you like to know more?
Mm.
And until every one of your board members is comfortable doing that, you shouldn't ever have any expectation that they would ask for money.
That's a good point. I love what you just said about the development committee on the board. We did not have that. And so, and I really appreciate my old organization. I don't want to speak ill of them in any way.
Sure.
It's interesting to me what you just shared, that I think probably the disconnect was that I didn't have a board advocate. And I, as a development person, needed someone on the board that would advocate for fundraising because they were on the board and fundraising was part of what they were doing. So that is a great tip for maybe those who have smaller boards or boards that are just starting out, to set up that specific development bridge between the staff and the board. That's a great idea.
I think it's also it has to do with also a larger conversation about what do committees on boards do, right? And far too often they act like fiduciary risk managers, and they don't act like thought partners, right? Because they weren't actually told that they were thought partners.
Yeah.
They actually weren't told they have interesting and important jobs. They were probably undersold the jobs so that they say yes, or that they wouldn't say no.
Good point.
And so if there is a development committee, most times you ask a development chair what the job of the development committee is, they're going to say, well, we actually provide oversight to the development team to make sure, and then they trail off, things are kind of going okay. And I'm like, isn't that the executive director's job? Like, what's your board work? And there is. And I think until we start to recruit with a really serious intentional description that the board has its own work to do, we're going to continue to see this same kind of dynamic.
Yeah. I think we've talked about, step one is recruiting correctly, and then step two is setting up the right functions for the board once they have been recruited, and saying, this person owns this person owns this, and that makes the board run a little bit smoother, which is
Totally
wise. I mean, that's how companies work too. Everybody has a job, so that's a good idea.
And it's always good to know what your job is too. You see,
yes, I agree.
And this is my thing about board recruitment is that we come from such a place of scarcity around the nonprofit sector is just riddled with this scarcity mindset. And so board recruitment, it's all about, I need to put a butt in a seat, and I have somebody who might say yes, and I don't want to do anything to dissuade them. So then when it comes to, we wouldn't want to tell them it's a hard job or an important job. We wouldn't want to have to tell them that they have a fundraising obligation. They might say no, and then I have no butt to put in that seat, right? But the thing we just miss time and time again is that people who volunteer to be of interest to sit on boards, they actually want to do important work.
Yeah.
They want to do important work. They need to understand that they have an important job. They need to understand what it is. They need to have the tools to do it well. But for the most part, people don't join boards, they join boards because they care and they want to be really good at their jobs.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you said earlier. There's the ask, which is made by the staff, but really it's more of an invitation to say, hello, welcome to this opportunity to serve this mission. Would you like to be part of it? And that's the success. And if they do want to be part of it, then they're on board. Like, we should be able to ask them for things, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That is absolutely right. And that's what I think about, is I do think it's important for nonprofit staff to move away from, do you know someone wealthy or wealth adjacent? Who do you know who can give money? And instead say, what we really want you to think of yourself as is an ambassador and a storyteller who's in the invitation business, that you're part of this wonderful organization and it's meaningful to you and it lights you up. And you want to say, would you like to join me? Can I invite you to join me to be a part of this organization in whatever way whatever that might look like for you, right? And if it turns out that person has capacity, great. That turns out that person's a volunteer. We also happen to know that volunteers happen to be wildly generous to the causes they volunteer for. So if we start, sometimes I think nonprofit executives get themselves into trouble by making it about that transaction, as opposed to reframing and making it and getting board members to think of themselves as storytellers who are inviting people to come closer to an organization they feel passionate about.
Yeah, and that's so much more fun. If you're passionate about this organization and you get to tell people about it, that sounds like a dream.
Right, isn't it? It's like I'm at this incredible, meaningful party. Don't
Right.
you want to come?
Yes.
Right. And what's also great about that, Julia, is that I can't control whether or not they accept my invitation. I know that.
Yeah.
I just happen to know I'm at this remarkably meaningful party, and I would love for you to join me.
And if they want to miss out, that's on them. I mean, come on, it's a great party.
That's exactly right. And then you move on, and that's how no becomes harder, easier to hear.
Mm-hmm.
No becomes easier to hear because it's not about you. They haven't accepted the invitation for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that honestly takes off so much pressure.
Right?
We're just here to tell people about our cause, and if they want to be part of it, they will.
Totally. I mean, so it's not like you arrive to a board, somebody gives you a crowbar and says, "Okay, take a crowbar to anybody's wallet you can get your hands on." I mean,
Yeah.
come on.
Good point. Yeah, no one will be passing out any crowbars at any board meetings, I'm sure.
No.
And if they do, maybe don't join that board.
Correct.
Well, this is really helpful. Let's get into like some of the dollars and cents of fundraising. So what strategies have you seen to be most effective in motivating board members to become active fundraisers? What are some things they practically do to raise money?
Once you do some of these kinds of things I'm about to talk about, then they're going to want to invite people, right? So if I am recruited, understanding that I have to use that it is expected that I am going to reach out broadly into my networks and invite people to get closer to this organization, then I'm going to understand that I'm going to do that. So it starts there. I believe that boards should, the one strategy that a number of my clients engage in motivating boards to become active fundraisers is storytelling workshops. Right? Practice storytelling. Sometimes it's a role play, right? I am a lapsed donor. You are a board member, right? And you can do it in pairs. You can have somebody stand up and do their elevator pitch, and then the room can say, the chair can say, okay, what worked, or the chair of development, what worked about Joan's pitch? What do you wish she had said? Right? So that everybody starts to get comfortable. What that also means, and it's the third thing, is that the staff has to continually fuel the board with impact stories all the time. Easy to digest, current, impactful stories with real names that I can insert into my story, right? That I can insert into my pitch so that I can say, I love being a part of organization X. We do remarkable work. We blah, 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 blah. Can I tell you a quick story, right? Insert story there. And it comes regularly from the staff to the board. And then I can embed it into my pitch. And then I have current stories to tell. I do not think nonprofit staff does a good enough job of fueling the board with current stories. I also, by the way, it's not just in one-on-one conversations. How about social media posts that you send out to your full board? Can you post this on Facebook? Here's some copy, but you can make it your own. I'm on the board of this organization. This is an incredible story. I thought you'd really want to know about this. I'm so proud to be a part of X. Learn more at. Right? So that we actually give board members the tools to be those champions. Yeah. And then the last thing that I think is really important in motivating board members, and we do not ask board members to do this often enough because we think they will say no, which is to engage in donor stewardship programs. This is something that should be run out of the board development committee, where everyone has one or two or three, whatever it is, donors, prospective donors, This is a great strategy for people who may have difficulty with a high give or get, right? Is that I maintain and develop over the course of a year a relationship with the following 4 donors. And at the end of that year, because I've been fueled stories, I've had some kind of connection. Maybe you as the development director, Julia, you say, would you like to renew Mary?
Mm-hmm.
And I might say to you, I learned that I pretty much think she had got some inherited wealth. We were talking about that. We might actually be able to ask her for more, right? So stewardship of current donors or prospective donors or lapsed donors can actually get you onto the field in a really powerful way. And like I said, and it is the perfect strategy when people say, oh, that person cannot meet our give or get, put them right in charge of a donor steward program of X number of donors. And if they are serious about it and they get the right kind of tools from the staff, they'll hit their give or get.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's very interesting to think through like former givers that maybe could have been good friends with members of my board, like, kind of like a friendship matchmaking anyway. They already are passionate about what our mission was. They are similar to our board members, and giving them the opportunity to build those relationships seems like a natural bridge.
Well, I run an online learning community for about 5,000 board and staff leaders of small to mid-sized nonprofits from North America and around the world, called the Nonprofit Leadership Lab. And it is one of our big go-to pieces of content, which is a lapsed donor outreach, not program really. It's a letter. It's a script, right? We always assume that lapsed donors are furious at us for some reason. 9 times out of 10, they're not angry at all. They didn't even know they stopped giving, or life got in their way. It is low-hanging fruit of the finest variety. And if you can get your board development committee reaching out to lapsed donors, that's like a grand slam home run.
Oh my gosh, as a former development director, if anybody was reaching out to my lapsed donors, I would be thrilled. That would be a huge piece off my plate.
Right. And you're not calling them to say, why have you stopped? You call, hey, you have been a very generous donor to our organization in the past, and we wanted to check in on you. How's everything going? Right. And we also need to learn about our relationships with our donors, and wondered if they're, you have not made a donation in a couple of years, and we just wondered if, how are you doing? Is there, what might be helpful for us to know about that?
And I love the idea of the board being part of normal conversation. Like, lapsed donors is something I had to do very often as a development director, and bringing a board member into that normal fundraising conversation will A, make them see the hard work that the nonprofit is doing, but B, will have them see some of those victories, which I know as a development director, when I started seeing some of those victories, I was more confident when I went to fundraise. And so if we can bring the board in on some of this low-hanging fruit, then maybe they'll be more confident to share the right stories and to ask when they can, and all of those things.
Yep. Putting board members in front of donors and just getting them comfortable exercising the muscle of being in relationship with your donors. Like, you can't just go from 0 to, would you consider a $25,000 gift? It just doesn't work that way for anyone, with the possible exception of me in the first week at GLAD. Your name again?
That only works when it's completely necessary to keep the door open.
Amen.
Great. Well, I think that is really helpful. Those are really practical tips for our listeners to get started. One story I'd love to hear from you is if you've seen any success stories from a nonprofit that transformed their board from maybe not super active, or like you were saying, the fiduciary only board, to a fundraising team. Have you seen that happen with any nonprofits?
I'm thinking about one board that transformed, and I certainly could tell you one thing that they didn't do. They didn't waste any money bringing in some consultant to train them on how to ask
Mm,
for money. I think that's just actually a waste of time, right? Um, and I believe that a board that is able to um, successfully add financial resources to an organization, it's a systemic thing, right?
mm,
It's not an individual skill or competency,
mm,
right? It is a compilation of some of the things we've been talking about, Julia. It is about being explicit at the time of recruitment,
mm,
making sure that you are recruiting a group of people that have different spheres of influence. You have to be able to fish in lots of different ponds. What I think about is the most powerful nonprofits have big, big, big posses. And the reason that they're big is because every person that comes to the table has their own sphere of influence. This is why the friend of a friend is a problem, right? Because they're not bringing any new people. This is why diversity, at least on one level, why diversity is
mm.
so important. Because if I'm I'm a member of a diverse community, I'm just going to have a completely different sphere of influence. um, and I bring all of those people with me, right?
Mhm.
Who's in my rollerboard, when I drag it into a board meeting. So I'd say recruitment, I'd say diversity,
Mhm.
um, and this board that I'm thinking of changed how they recruited. They put somebody who was really good in development as the head of the recruitment committee,
That is smart. That
right?
makes sense.
Um, We then worked with the executive director and shifted their mindset from why isn't my board doing more to why aren't you doing more to fire them up?
Mm.
Look at your board meetings. Are you engaging? Are you enriching them? Do they leave all ignited? I see that agenda. I wouldn't. What's happening? I just talk about inform plus enrich plus engage equals ignite. And that every board meeting needs to actually fire your board members up so they want to be champions. So they want to go home and say, we had the most fascinating conversation. I learned so much more about the systemic causes of food insecurity in our county, thanks to this guest who came in and talked about X. And I feel even more strongly I should be doing something. And then this whole idea of like storytelling workshops. So these are the kinds of things: recruitment, diversity, the staff making a commitment to ignite the board members often, regularly, and then reframing fundraising from an ask to an invitation.
Oh,
Um, those are the kinds of things that this particular board that I'm thinking of engaged in to become a very different board, a board where when those individuals were completed with their tenure, when their terms were over, and they got their perfunctory pen or something, you could have them stand up and say, "Tell me about your board experience these last 3 terms." And you want them to be able to say something about how accomplished they felt,
Mhm.
about how they've seen the organization change. They want to be able to talk about how the group of board members is that they respect them so much that they actually know them more deeply than they did when they started, that they have shared values. All of these things start to create an engine on the board, um, where they understand that they have work to do in partnership with the staff.
That is amazing. I think those 4 things are so valuable, and they would happen in 2 waves. So the recruitment and the diversity happens in the beginning, and then the other 2, the firing them up and making them know their impact and all of that, happens consistently. And that's something that fundraisers and development people do anyway. We're telling our donors constantly about the cool things happening in our
Correct.
programs. We could do that. That sounds great.
I actually have this. I was working with an organization once, a long time ago, but we're doing a board retreat when I facilitated board retreats. And the board chair said, our CEO is, we always hear about how incredibly charismatic she is and how she lights people up and ignites people when she does public speaking.
Mhm.
Could you ask that CEO to show up at our board retreat?
Yeah, smart.
Right?
Yeah,
As
yeah.
opposed to like, okay, I have to get through the agenda. I have to do the things so that I can put this retreat behind me and get back to my work. No, actually, right? Engaging your board and firing them up is essential to your work.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and you've touched on a few things, which this is kind of an off the cuff question for you, but what are some of the qualities that people should be looking for in a board? You mentioned change management, you mentioned diversity. Are there any other things that people should think, oh, this would be a great asset of a board member?
So it really depends on what kind of stage an organization is at, right?
Mhm.
And what things are, how big an organization is. And I look at attributes as much as anything else. Has this person been a leader?
Mm.
Does this person have leadership skills? I remember talking to a client one time. I knew this person had a very toxic board chair. And I was talking to her and she said, "You're going to be excited, Joan. I have 4 board members that are going to be voted in tonight." And I said, "Which of them is going to be your next board chair?"
Mm.
"Oh, I don't think any of them. They're never going to have time." I said, "Well, then am I supposed to be proud of you?" Because they
Yeah.
hadn't actually recruited for leadership skills.
Mm.
Facilitation, diplomacy, team player.
Mm.
What are this person's values? What do they want out of board service? Right? Do they want to be something more than a group of individuals? Are they good communicators?
Mm.
Um, but honestly, the single most important thing is when you ask somebody, why would you like to be on this board? If they say, because I want to give back, move on.
Mm. Really?
Sure. Because let's say, I live in a town, Montclair, New Jersey, where there are about 95 nonprofits, 95 opportunities to give back.
Mm.
What I want to know is, why do you want to be on this board? What is the passion that you bring to this cause?
Wow.
Why?
Yeah.
Tell me. Lived experience, connection, what is it about it? So that I can see whether or not you have a pilot light on for our work. Because if there's no pilot light on for our work, I can't ignite it further because it's not on to begin with.
That is a great point. I would have never thought of that. I would have thought, wow, how generous. Yes,
I want
please
to
come
give
give
back.
back.
Yeah, okay. You can give back at the art museum. You could give back at the
Great point.
substance abuse clinic. You could give back at the food pantry. You could, right? I mean, 95 ways to give back. If you can't be
Mhm.
more specific than that, then you haven't really answered my question.
Well, and we've talked about recruitment a lot, but that goes back to the importance of having that question in your recruitment. You don't want to find out later that they don't have the pilot light on for your organization.
No,
That's a early on conversation for sure.
it is an early on conversation for sure.
Great point.
And you will find, by the way, Julia, that when you start to look at your board not as a collective, but you start to say, okay, how many rock stars do I have? How much of my board is dead weight? Who's kind of in the swing middle, right? You're almost always going to find those people that are dead weight. Either they joined for the wrong reason, they didn't have a pilot light on to begin with, right?
Yeah.
It's those things that you could have flagged for at the very beginning.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I have one more question for you. I mean, honestly,
Sure.
I feel like we could sit here and talk all day long. I so appreciate all of your input.
Well, I will
But
tell you that my 7-month-old grandson has just learned how to babble. Like he wasn't,
ooh.
right? He was just, before he was just like shrieking and doing those things. And my daughter said, he's learned to babble just like you.
Oh no. Well, I appreciate it. It's been very helpful, and the information you've given is so practical, and I can't wait to see how people implement it into their boards.
I'm super happy about that.
Well, as we look ahead, we've talked a lot about what you should do while you're setting up the board, but looking ahead in general for boards and nonprofits, do you see any trends or changes happening for board engagements in nonprofit world?
There's a change I really wanted to see that I haven't, that I don't think has come to fruition yet.
Well, maybe this is where we start it. We're about to start it right here. You heard it here
So,
first.
um, I talked earlier about nonprofits coming from a place of scarcity, right?
Mhm.
Or under-resourced. Nobody knows about us. We're a hidden gem. By the way, you're not a gem if you're hidden. My book. Anyway, the I think that nonprofits are historically surprisingly change resistant,
Mm,
largely because their boards behave like risk managers, making sure nothing goes wrong, staying in the fiduciary landscape. During the pandemic, nonprofit organizations broke out of that. They were innovative, they were nimble. Yes, they were totally exhausted, but also really fired up in a lot of ways
mm,
because they were actually thinking outside of the box, trying things they'd never done before, doing things they thought would take a year that took 2 weeks. And the boards were excited too. And I wish um, that staff would be more intentional about marketing the lessons of that
mm,
to the board, to be able to move the board away from the tarmac of risk management up into the higher altitudes. I wish that we could start to see more of a culture of piloting and innovation in our organizations that we learned was extremely powerful in the pandemic.
mm,
And I so wanted that to be the treasure in the darkness of the pandemic. And I think that there's still an opportunity for us to really begin to shift the mindset of our boards from being risk managers to being change agents,
mm,
because that is in fact what the nonprofit sector exists to do. Change hearts, change minds, change laws, change your attitude towards nature, all of those things. We are in the business of change.
mm,
And so that's what I hope for, is that boards could be recruited with more intentionality and that they can see the different levels of governance that they should be engaged in so that they can be partners with staff in trying new things, illustrating proof of concept with a pilot, and then going and securing funding, right? All those things that are possible, and moving from that scarcity model to one of abundance where you start to think about what's possible.
mm. That is incredibly wise, Joan. I really appreciate that as encouragement for our listeners, for a way to fire up and ignite, like you said, their board, people that are already passionate about what they're doing, but here's a new way to engage and be passionate. I think that's really helpful and practical.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I always really appreciate speaking with you, and I'm sure
Likewise.
that many people are going to be able to leave listening or watching this with some practical advice.
Well, and I mean, you all are in the business of supporting nonprofit leaders to be able to fuel the nonprofit sector, and I'm always really happy to have the opportunity to add my voice to your chorus.
Thank you so much, Joan. It's great to see you, and hopefully we'll
Likewise.
talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Nonprofit Expert, presented by Donor Perfect. For more information and a special offer, visit donorperfect.com/podcast.